Welcome to Pomegranate Radio with your host, Jonathan Cook.
David Mamet's film adaptation of his play Oleana bears the tagline, "Whatever side you take, you're wrong." I can think of no better phrase to describe the impossibility of discussing a novel dealing with rape. The moment one critic calls the novel powerful, another will argue that all novels dealing with rape are considered powerful, solely because of the subject matter and not because they bear any artistic merit. The moment one critic dares say the novel is lacking in some area, another will say that critic is part of the problem, is promoting the culture that allows, indeed endorses, rape. How can I possibly discuss this book without being seen as explicitly pandering to my audience? I can't. How can I, as a man, criticize this book's failures without being seen as implicitly endorsing something so upsetting that I had to take better than 3 weeks just to read the entire book? I can't. And asking for it is an abject failure, but not because the subject matter is such that critics will roll their collective eyes and say, well, of course rape is bad, but because what the novel does right, it does so right that it makes what it does wrong all the worse. Consider Emma's thoroughly unlikable personality. Ostensibly, it's meant to illustrate that any woman can be raped, including the thoroughly unlikable. Emma, however, never comes across as queen bitch, so much as a typical and frankly quite boring teenage girl. Vain, self-centered, painfully insecure. This undercuts her challenge to the reader's sympathies. Because she is not likable enough to elicit a strong sense of sympathy, and because her less flattering personality traits are suspect, the reader is almost forced to view her as a sad, uncompelling character of no real aspect. Arguably, the novel does suggest O'Neill wasn't really interested in Emma as a character, beyond using her as a challenge to the reader's notions of who a victim could be, but such a choice runs the risk of alienating the reader. It's difficult to say that entirely happens here, but the aftermath of the rape is certainly weakened because the reader goes into the second half of the novel feeling precious little for Emma. But then the rape occurs. And for fully half of the novel, the reader is ensconced in Emma's never-ending nightmare. Here, the novel rises above its contemporaries to give something sorely lacking in rape literature, a genuinely frightening and heart-rending look at the psychology of a rape victim before the victim even attempts to begin coping. The isolation, the resentment, the accusations, all of these are in the novel, and rightly so, but they are not given the primacy that so much rape literature relies on. Instead, O'Neill foregrounds Emma's inability and unwillingness to acknowledge events. She cannot remember events. There is a hole where those memories should be. And because of this, she cannot bring herself to acknowledge that she was a victim of her rapists. Even when looking at photographic evidence, far more disturbingly described than in any other young adult literature I've read, Emma refuses to believe that she didn't ask for it to happen. She never outright says she did ask for it, though she does say she did not ask for the aftermath, but she cannot bring herself to dismiss the possibility. By coming forward and saying she was raped, she, in her mind, destroyed the lives of everyone involved, for which she feels an overwhelming sense of guilt. She hates herself for what happened after the rape. I repeat, she hates herself. And O'Neill is relentless on this point. Nothing else happens in the second half of the novel, save for perhaps the last 20 pages. Emma spends the entire second half loathing herself and begging for some kind of escape. She goes through the motions of getting better, of seeking medical and psychological treatment, but at no point does she think she actually deserves anything but her suffering. She did this. She did this to herself. And reading the second half of this novel is brutal. Brutal. Up to a certain point. One could argue that little of substance happens in the first half of the novel, aside from the rape itself. But whereas the first half benefits from being narratively interesting, the second half relies entirely upon being psychologically enlightening. And though it is also a one-trick pony that wears out all too quickly. As harrowing as Emma's mind is, there is a point at which we begin longing for the narrative to move on to something else. O'Neill's point appears to be that victims can't always move on, that they sometimes become stuck in the trauma due to a lack of support and understanding. But because the reader feels so little for Emma going into the rape, it's difficult to sustain the reader's sympathies for nearly 160 pages of non-stop anxiety and self-loathing. As an adult well-versed in literature lacking a strong plot, I did find the second half compelling, but I struggle to imagine the average teenager sitting down with this novel and not becoming, for lack of a better term, bored. Guiltily so, I'll concede, with Emma's misery, if only because nothing else happens. Young adult literature is at its best when it remembers to put the story first and allows the themes to branch off from the story organically. Asking for it asks much more of its audience. It asks for a willingness to view excruciating pain without any relief. It is a bold gamble on O'Neill's part, and I'm hesitant to call it successful. Unquestionably unsuccessful, however, is O'Neill's attempt at writing a novel dealing with rape culture. The novel, when it actually attempts to introduce the issue of rape culture at all, relies entirely on the superficial. Dressing provocatively means that a woman is asking for something bad to happen. That is the deepest that the novel probes. At no point does the novel even attempt to address why society responds the way it does. It merely acknowledges that it does respond the way it does. The novel attempts to guilt its reader into accepting rape culture as a fact, without evidence, without discussion. The worst offender of this is the novel's treatment of Emma's family. Emma's mother, Nora, a vapid excuse for a human being in the beginning, made even more vapid by the stress of coping with her daughter's rape, is portrayed as an angry alcoholic solely due to her daughter's rape. And Nora's anger is dismissed as inappropriate and unsupportive. Of course she's angry! Her daughter was raped! Were she not angry, she would be competing with Medea for the title of worst mother ever. Even more alarming is the novel's treatment of Dennis, Emma's father. Dennis distances himself to the point of refusing to speak to his daughter after her rape. Emma recalls her father asking why she allowed this to happen, why she put herself in that situation. As is typical of so much rape literature, it ignores any complexity in favor of reinforcing the presupposed conclusion that rape victims are not supported the way they need to be. Again, of course he's angry! His daughter was raped! In his distance, he's not saying that he doesn't love his daughter. He's saying that he failed as a parent. Not only to instill the values that would have limited her promiscuity, but also to protect his child from harm. His distance comes not necessarily from an absence of love, but from an overabundance of guilt. In his anger, he lashes out at those nearest because he has to go somewhere with his anger, however inappropriate those places might be. He is trying to understand what cannot be explained. Why does this happen? Perhaps that is why the novel fails to adequately address rape culture, because rape culture seeks to explain something that ultimately cannot be explained. Why does nature produce aberrants? It just does. Maybe not intentionally, but every so often, nature produces monsters. Rape culture believes that rapists are products of societal influences and seeks to reveal those influences and by revealing them, eliminate them. The unfortunate consequence is that rape culture reduces the individual's accountability. A boy who rapes a girl did a bad thing, yes, but he was a product of society. Sometimes nature produces monsters, and sometimes those monsters just hate women. I give Asking for It 3 out of 5 stars. It's a harrowing read, but it's a flawed read. This is Jonathan for Pomegranate Radio, saying thank you for listening. You've been beautiful. Have a good night.